Greetings everyone, my name is Charles Kovach, your not safe for work presidential candidate, and I'm going to share with you a little story. A not so long time ago, in a galaxy created to be far, far away, there existed not a single person, just a bunch of AI scripts that would go about their programmed business, doing whatever it is that they were programmed to do. And then some people showed up. And for the sake of this story, let's just say that those people had no association with each other at all. It was all just a bunch of individuals. It was complete anarchy. But then, people bumped into each other. And sometimes, when they bumped into each other, they agreed, we're not going to mess with each other, either implicitly or explicitly. They agreed that they're not going to mess with each other and just go about doing whatever they were doing. But other people, well, they didn't share the same sentiment. Pick whatever reason you want. Let's just say one person had something that the other person wanted. So, one person decided to attack the other person. And eventually, let's say the attacker won. Well, the guy who lost, he probably didn't like that much. So, maybe wanted to get his stuff back. So, get a couple friends and go after the person that attacked him originally. In his own little posse, you know how it is. Now, granted, it's not that easy in Eve, but you get the point. But this guy grabs a bunch of people, goes after the guy that attacked him. Okay, well, the guy that is now the loser, the original attacker, well, he didn't like that. He didn't like that he was ganged up on. So he got some friends of his own. More friends. And he went back and took revenge on all those people that took him out. And the other side, well, they got angry, got even more recruits, and so on, the story goes as both sides get bigger and bigger and bigger. Well, it stopped being anarchy a long time ago. But these groups of people, they formed corporations. Now, the developers of EVE Online, they don't get too involved in people's affairs in the game, unless they're doing something to break the game, so forth. It's pretty much do whatever the game allows, and you either deal with it or go away. Sounds like libertarianism, as these corporations grew and started to have massive effects on the game and the economy and the world in general that was created. Let's hear of some interesting stories that came from EVE Online. Let's start with the bank of EVE Online. One young enterprising person decided it would be a good idea to start his own little company as a bank. You see, when you die in EVE Online, you lose a large amount of the currency, which is called ISK. But this person who decided to have a bank would store people's ISK, keep a register, and apparently did a very good job. So much so that many people decided to keep their money safe with this person and his company. But then one day he turned around and said, you know what? I got a lot of money. I'm going to use all this money, build a fortress, hire a bunch of mercenaries, and then I'm going to keep the rest of it. Well, what did the developers do? Nothing. They're not going to interfere. Again, the libertarian statement of the government should stay out of corporations' way. Now, you can argue that you don't mean it in such a literal sense, but be careful of the words you choose. Let's go to another example. Well, you see corporations, they're competing for resources and whatnot. And one of them decided, you know what would be nice if we could plant some guy into our rival corporation and get something out of it. So this guy goes undercover into another corporation for, what was it, a year or so? And works his way up the ranks, earns a considerable amount of trust. And then I believe he stole a bunch of, a bunch of ships? I might be getting my stories confused. He had his whole scheme where he said, oh, I'm going to loan my ship to another person. And he started this whole thing of people just in his upper circle just loaning ships to each other until quite a few people... Oh, no, I'm getting my stories confused. But, yeah, so the idea is that one corporation... The original point I was trying to get to was one corporation had infiltrated another corporation, and through their infiltration had stolen a large amount of stuff from the second corporation. Did the developers of EVE Online do anything about this? Because why should government stand in the way of corporations? I mean, this is a totally corporate matter. Both parties were corporations. Another story that came out of EVE Online. Well, you know, corporations, they have to have property, right? And things like security might be an issue. Maybe so much so that you need a military force. But, you know, people talk, and just because two people are working for two different corporations doesn't mean that they should never talk to one another, right? But this one general, interesting, corporation having a general, decided, you know what? This other corporation sounds a whole lot better. I think I'm going to go and work for that one. Of course, this was after he had been persuaded by people he knew in this other corporation. So this general decided, oh, I'm going to switch sides. Well, General essentially had the keys for a whole shitload of fortresses that was owned by the corporation. And he took them all with him. Gave them to the new corporation. Did the developers of EVE Online do anything? Noticing a pattern here? I'm not talking about the one of the developers not doing anything. Rather interesting that a corporation would have generals and fortresses. You see, in the game of EVE Online, the corporations control massive amounts of digital space, territory. That's the pattern I'm talking about. You know, pretty interesting when you take power away from something, and I know this is something I've said before, when you take power away from something or someone, you create a void. And that void is going to be filled somehow by someone. So, when you say government should stay out of the way of business or corporations, well, eventually the word corporation just replaces government. Just like it has become in EVE Online, because they control territories, they have their own policies, and they have their own military and enforcement of various whatever. And sometimes I'll say, that Shadowrun is a game that I like to play, but not a world I want to live in. And much like EVE Online, the world of Shadowrun, although it is scripted as part of the story, is run by the world is run by corporations, not really by governments. Same thing for what was that show, Dark Matter? The one where they all wake up and they don't remember who they are. So, I wanted to use this opportunity to talk about libertarianism and anarchy. So libertarianism, I'm pretty sure I've beaten my point in by now, runs the folly of saying, hey, I'm not going to restrict anything from gaining power. Let's look at our current situation. Let's just pick one corporation, shall we? Alphabet, which owns Google, which owns YouTube. How intricated, that's a word, how intricate in our lives is Google, even if we don't directly interact with it. It's made a way into a lot of classrooms, a lot of businesses, and a great deal of many other things. If Alphabet decided that it wants to just turn off everything it controls for one day, how do you think the world would respond? How do you think the world would function? As I said, if you let corporations supersede government, then eventually the word corporation becomes a new word for government. There's this whole notion that the government, in and of itself, just its mere existence, is a bad thing, and that it is something to either be lessened, or in the case of anarchists, to be gotten rid of. Okay. Do you want to get rid of or lessen, say, guns? Because much like a gun, or a hammer, or your car, or anything else, a government is just a tool. Just like a corporation is just a tool. But the question is, what is that tool being used for? The question is, who's in control of that tool? So what's the difference between a government and a corporation? Well, a government is ultimately accountable to the people, and requires, through one form or another, that people merely make the decisions of how things should be, whether it be by vote or by revolution. And this is something that evens the playing field. It keeps people from having power unevenly distributed, even though there are governments that do unevenly distribute power. But that's another conversation. But a corporation is a hierarchy. Many are designed to be that way. You have owners, and you have owners or shareholders, and then you have the CEO and so forth. Now, what is the purpose of a government, and what is the purpose of a corporation? Well, the purpose of a government is to manage the affairs of the state. Shut up, computer. The purpose of a corporation is to make profit. And I find it very interesting because in the West, corporations seek control as a way to make profit. But in the East, corporations seek profit as a way to gain control. At least that's how it is from my perspective. So this notion that government should stay out of the way is mere folly. Because, and I'll say it again, once you create a power vacuum, something will take its place. And if it's a corporation, then corporation becomes the new word for government. And personally, I would much rather have a ruling body that is accountable to the people than that is accountable to the few. Kind of why I'm running in the first place. So, is there much difference between a corporation and a government? Depends. Depends on its position and its power. But ultimately, the control is based on the type and how it's used. Its effects is based on the type and how it's used, and who's in control of it. So when it comes to people who want this fantasy world of government stepping out of the way of corporations, you're really just creating a cycle of things rising and falling, because a corporation is not an inherently benevolent thing, nor is it an inherently malevolent thing, and the same thing is said for a government. So the whole idea of libertarianism falls apart because it rests on the concept that one is inherently bad and one is inherently good. You can't say one tool is inherently bad, one tool is inherently good. That's like saying, okay, well, I have a nail and I got a screwdriver. Well, the screwdriver is inherently bad as a tool because it doesn't help me put the nail in the wood. Now, anarchy. I had a rather interesting discussion the other day. A person was telling me and sending me all sorts of quote that anarchy means no rulers, but it doesn't mean no rules. That's very interesting. Who makes these rules? Who enforces them? How can you have rules if nobody's enforcing them? Well, if there are rules that, let's say, every single person agrees to, that does not meet the definition of anarchy. That is a consensual democracy, because 100% of the people agreed to it. But let's say we live in an anarchy with rules. Well, if there are rules and somebody chooses to ignore the rules, what does it matter? If I decide to enact the rules, or some person decides to enact the rules, somebody becomes an enforcer of the rules, well, guess what? They now become the ruler. Because they chose to enact a rule. Anybody who chooses to enact the rules becomes a ruler by default. And I always put this question to anarchists that say that you can't have, or that they just want to get rid of government. What happens when somebody does something you don't like? Now, you can argue for an individualized autocracy where everyone is the ruler of themselves. Still not an anarchy. So if you have your own rules and you are the ruler of yourself, and somebody breaks your rules and you act against them, that's still not an anarchy. And anarchy is a word that's really a hyperbolic term that really serves no purpose other than a thought experiment. Because, just like the very beginning of my story, as soon as two people clash, they make rules. And the rules are either we're going to get along or we're not. And these two or more people, are the ones who are doing the ruling by one way or another. So, I wanted to have this little talk to examine these two words and these two ideologies because they're important to look at. And yes, they are important to entertain, not in reality because they serve no practical purpose and they are self-defeating in reality, but as thought experiments. And I will leave it there. And once again, my name is Charles Kovach, and I am interested in a more direct democracy. Something where you and I get to call the final shots on the rules that govern our lives. Where you and I are the final controllers, and the end-all be-all controllers of the government. And if that is a concept that interests you, then I urge you to spread the word about this campaign, and at least this very concept, and I thank you for your time. And